Hey watercolor wizards, Hajra here. As a heads up, my Twitch live streams will now be on Thursday afternoons, Pacific Standard Time, rather than on Fridays. Again, I've sped up and voice over the footage of these two streams. If you want to watch them in real time with the live Q&A and original audio, they'll be available for 2 weeks after they aired on my Twitch account. So I demoed 3 different ways to do ink and watercolor washed florals, going from looser to tighter styles. I'm using my Zig Rider pigment waterproof markers to ink, and they each have 2 tips, a thick and a thin pointed tip. For the first simple ink floral, I'm just using the lightest brown color called chocolate, which is similar to a burnt sienna hue. It's basically just a simple doodle that can be done freehand and unplanned and works as an easy or beginner ink floral journal page or as part of a larger design or piece, like a simple ink floral painted on fabric or pottery or wallpaper or carpet within a larger, more complicated piece. The colors for the doodle are also just quick accents if you choose to do them. The background can be amplified with further simple positive and negative leaf or other shapes. The second type of ink floral will be a bit tighter and thus involve the thinner tip of the marker instead. This style is popular for vintage type pieces and involves a lot of hatching and cross-hatching of sections. The hatching immediately brings a tighter feel and denser weight to the florals, very different from the earlier thick line floral doodle. Florals are a good subject to ease into inking or painting because landscapes and florals are generally less challenging subjects than birds, which are in turn less challenging than mammals, which are less challenging than humans, usually the hardest subjects to paint. If there are no watercolor washes added later, white paint or ink or a white gel pen can be used to correct any unwanted ink lines. Working in just black ink and white paint will really free you up to make mistakes and adjustments, but the game changes if you're using color. The white paint or pen can be resistant to watercolor if it's permanent, or bleed and run under watercolor if it's water soluble. So it does limit an ink piece to black and white if it's used a lot. In this case, I will just work in black ink and watercolor and won't be using white in any of the demos. Hatching comes in all sorts of styles itself and can be made super dense and realistic or really simple. The hatching I do here is somewhat flat, not curving with the contours, and middling in complexity. The rose will develop so the ink will give it about 3 values: the white of the paper, the shadow black fills, and the mid-dark of the hatches. The simple color we add later will give this type of ink piece 2 additional values for a total of 5. The 4th value is the base tint wash of local color. Here, either the thin red wash applied for the rose or thin green wash for the stems. The last layer and 5th value will be a thick red or green applied screen printing hard edge style in select areas. It'll look like red or green marker has been applied in places. The color can also be applied in soft glazes and more realistically, but I chose not to because this is still not realism and it's ink dominant because of all the hatching, so simple color accents work better here. So we end up with 4 value roses with the 5th value of the white only showing up in the background unless you choose to save any white highlights on the petals. Moving on to the last type of ink and watercolor wash style, this will be the most realistic of the 3 ink florals. And where the other 2 were ink dominant examples, this will be color dominant with fewer ink lines. For this one, I used the coffee colored Zig, which has a sepia hue to it, and notice how my lines are tighter and more careful than the second hatched ink roses example, which was of course tighter and more careful than the first loose doodle. I'm using pretty uniform line width. This is typical of inking done with a fine tip marker rather than a brush or a variable tip marker or a brush marker, all of which easily add line width variety. This line variation or line weight emphasizes shape and value, form and shadows, making the ink lines very expressive and informative even without any color. In this case, I will be making the color dominant, so I leave the ink in a thin, mostly uniform line, very light and airy, and leave value indication for the color part. Because this is the tightest of the 3 ink and wash demos, the watercolor will be added in more careful glazes with soft edges and blending. I'm using 3 of the same Gansai Tambi colors I used for the stained glass peacock piece. The first wash or 2 are wet into wet, and the following 2 or 3 glazes are wet on dry. Like I mentioned 2 weeks ago when this was a live stream, this flower is only 1 color, so painting it is like doing a grisaille value underpainting but in pink instead of gray. We stop at the 1 color, which is a convenient thing about monochromatic subjects. Because of the ink outlines, this third demo is still less realistic than a conventional botanical watercolor piece, which would have no ink lines to dampen the realism. When I move on to the second petal, I make sure it's not adjacent to the first one, which is still damp, and I want to prevent unwanted bleeds and blooms. The second smaller flower is white, so we paint in thin blue shadows on the petals in a single layer wash. The center of the flower is done in dots of yellow and a violet mix made from the blue and dark pink. I wrapped up the end of the first stream by laying down initial glazes for the petal leaf at the bottom. The warmer red is made from a mix of the pink with the yellow. Using a limited color scheme of 3 colors and their mixes will ensure color harmony. When I started the second stream, I had done single local color glazes on some of the other flowers, and we continued with the same wet into wet, then wet on dry, value building, and soft pink glazes. Once you have a petal or two done, the later petals can be compared value contrast-wise and finished look-wise to the first one. So it's a good gauge for how to do the next ones. I also briefly brought out and showed the first artist trading cards that I made. One is painted and done, and the other is still a sketch. And if you want to see what I did, check out my Spring Nymph artist trading card video on my YouTube channel. It was really fun and interesting to do a miniature painting at a 2.5 by 3.5 inch size. The flower piece is done on cellulose paper in a cold press finish in my moleskin journal. The ATC card was done on higher quality Arches watercolor paper in a hot press finish. Note the blend and saturation difference between the petals on the floral piece and the nymph scarf. The Arches watercolor paper performs much better. Arches or Arch watercolor paper is better than the moleskin or pentalic cellulose papers in just about everything for watercolor painting. Blends, lifts, color intensity, but the one place where the cheaper cellulose paper is better is that pencil graphite erases cleaner on it because it's not cotton and it has less sizing in it. And that's the one pro over the Arches paper that I found about the cellulose paper. I'm using staining transparent colors for these flowers, which are the best pigments for luminous petals because they give clean glazes and previous layers don't lift up as much. In contrast, opaque or semi-opaque colors used in thin glazes give muddy results. The centers of the big pink flowers are a yellowish green, and if there were no ink lines, they could be made more realistic with a fuzzy halo edge, but again, this is still a mixed ink line and watercolor piece, so I do it simpler and less realistic since the ink is already limiting the realism. The rose at the bottom left is also basically the same pink in the photo reference as the 2 flowers we already did, so I used some artistic license and made it a dusty rose lavender instead so it stands apart. For the wet on wet starting layer, use less water for the rose sections than we did for the large petals of the other pink flowers because you want more control and you don't want it to bleed into adjacent sections. The rose has not only value variation via color, but also temperature variation, so we can move from warmer inner shadow folds of red-violet to cooler outer petals of violet to affect a romantic light. The warm red leafy petal thing on the bottom right is a sort of plant that has white blooms in highlight areas. Since I didn't save any white areas when I put the warm red down, I can use white gouache now in the highlight areas, but since I want to keep the colors transparent, I choose to lift back to the desired highlights with a damp, not wet brush. This is a great way to whittle away soft edge highlights if you don't end up saving white areas someplace. The lifting back to white gives you value contrast and a sort of reverse grisaille to guide your later color application application. After the lifting, I'm just going to go back in with some color to deepen select shadow areas of this leafy petal, and the remaining small daisy-like flowers were completed off-stream, just like the larger white flower at the top, with simple blue shadows. And that completes our last inking with watercolor wash floral example. Hope you enjoyed the 3 different ink and wash florals from looser to tighter and learned some useful inking and painting techniques. As always, thanks for parking your brushes here. Please like, comment, subscribe, and check out my website links below. Until next time, wishing you all fantastical painting adventures.